Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.
Welcome to another edition of the Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg. Jacob, good morning, and how are you getting on with your new neighbour?
Good morning. It's very intriguing about my new neighbour moving in. I've chatted to him when he's been protesting. He's perfectly civilised. We just don't agree. And it's interesting that he's been provided with such convenient accommodation.
I mean, the cost of ruining your reputation as a working man, the area in which you live, it costs a bit. So it must be costing him a bit or someone else a bit to move into this accommodation. You should explain to the listeners who this person is, by the way. Since I failed to do so.
He's the gentleman who appears on television wearing a hat with an EU flag on it and a banner saying "Stop Brexit." And he's got a very good voice, so he can project "Stop Brexit" halfway across Westminster. Interestingly, the area in which I live was bought up by the London County Council, renovate Lord North Street and areas around, as a slum clearance in around 1900. And Smith Square was referred to in one of Disraeli's novels as having houses which were like a rat's bolt hole. So although it may now be a relatively salubrious area, it's yuppification, isn't that the word, that has taken place over the last 100 years?
But I mean, someone's paying to put this person in now what's rather salubrious accommodation, it would seem.
He's, I think, in the former residence of the representative of the Hong Kong government, which was sold by the Chinese government a couple of years ago. So it really is, it's a very, if that is the house, it's a really very nice, very substantial house, much bigger than the house I live in.
Well, at any rate, after this pleasant chit-chat, let's get down to the business of the week. And obviously, yet again, I'm interviewing you on a Monday. The Moggcast will be broadcast on a Tuesday, and we have the votes tomorrow. Just first of all, a kind of simple question, really, but it's one of clarification, which is, we read in the media, and we write ourselves at Conservative about the ERG. Is the ERG really a block of people who one can describe in such a way as to suggest that all 80 of them vote the same way?
No, that's never been the case. We're not a fourth party. We're not like the Lib Dems were when they were in coalition with the Conservatives when David Cameron was Prime Minister. We are a group of people who have similar views on the European question. And within that, there are differing emphases on particular parts of the agreement, and there are different views of how individual votes should be approached. So I think it'd be wrong to say that there are 80 who will always vote the same way, come hell or high water.
But if you or Mark Francois or Steve Baker pop up, we can presume that you speak for a certain body of the Kirk, can we not?
Well, I think it's difficult. We don't have formal ERG positions, but if people associated with the ERG say things, does that indicate a view that is held within the Conservative Party in Parliament? Yes, it does.
Is there an ERG view on the Murison Amendment?
The Murison Amendment doesn't really help because you still have the backstop. You have it for a year only, but then you've got the possibility of extending the implementation period for a year. But you would still have in that year the split between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, potentially. And there's always a risk with things that are extended for a year that they can be extended for longer. What happens if you get to the end of the year and the final agreement hasn't been reached? Does it then get extended again?
He's not proposing a unilateral right to leave.
He's not. He's proposing an end date rather than a unilateral right.
And is there any ERG view of the Brady Amendment?
Well, again, the Brady Amendment doesn't do anything clearly. It asks the government to go back, but what would it get in return? What I think we need is government policy. We need the government to stand up and say, this is what we're doing, this is our approach, and then people can say, okay, that's fine. As long as it's a backbench amendment, it's not clear where it would be going. And so what's the point in voting for it?
Just as a point of clarification on the Brady amendment, I think he's suggesting that although he's not seeking to amend the text of the withdrawal agreement, he is proposing something that would be legally binding in a codicil and therefore would remove the backstop.
That seems an interesting approach, to say the text is not changed, but there's a codicil that removes several hundred pages of the text.
Well,
don't quite see how that. You
not,
may be splitting hairs to save people's face, but actually,
I'm assuming that is the purpose, and very often in politics one does have to split hairs to save people's face.
I'm all in favour of saving people's face if that needs to be done, but that we have to know at the end of it that the backstop is out of the withdrawal.
And you're
agreement.
not really sure if the Brady Amendment delivers that?
I'm not sure if it does. I think if in effect you're reopening the text, it would be better to do so in practice.
Really, this is, I may well be proved wrong, this is looking quite difficult for the Murison Amendment and for the Brady Amendment, because if some members of the EAG are not happy with it, I could also see soft Brexiteers or Remainers at the other end of the party complaining about it on the ground that they believe the backstop's necessary.
But the issue with both these amendments is that the government apparently wants to show numbers to the European Union. It won't show numbers unless it's a government amendment. How many could the Brady Amendment get at most? It could get about 100 votes. But then it will be defeated by 500 to 100. So instead of looking as if there is movement in that direction, it will look as if there's movement in precisely the other direction, unless the government abstains. But the job of the government is to give a lead in these circumstances.
Just a bit of further grist to that mill, perhaps. It's not inconceivable, is it, that the Speaker might not select the Brady Amendment or the Murison Amendment?
That's absolutely true. The Speaker has considerable discretion in the amendments that he selects.
But it would be harder for the Speaker, surely, not to select a government amendment.
I think it would be extraordinarily unusual for the Speaker not to accept a government amendment, and I think he would feel that he had to accept a government amendment because routinely the government has a majority in the House and the Speaker wishes the House to have its ability to express its will.
Are you expecting a government amendment?
Hoping but not expecting.
And this is clearly where you've wanted to take the conversation, and it's a perfectly sensible place to take it for what it's worth. We've been arguing the same point on Conservative Home in the last few days. Namely, if you can't be sure the Speaker will select these other amendments anyway, if it's more likely he would select a government amendment, and if in any case you want the government to take a position, then surely the government must take a position. So why isn't the government taking a position?
That I don't know. I mean, I thought Nicky Morgan's article this morning spelled it out very clearly. I find very little difference between what she's saying and my view. I don't know. I think the government is, of course, nervous because it lost heavily last time, and it would want to be confident that it would at least have a decent vote for whatever it proposes. But time is running short. By the time this is broadcast, there will be very little time left. But if the government were to put down an amendment, it needs to build up support for it. And it can't do that in a few hours. It needs a little bit of time to explain to people, put the background to it. And that's the difficulty with backbench amendments, is that you don't know what effect they would have on government policy. Whereas if it's a government amendment, even a simple one, the government could fill it out and say, well, by changing the Irish backstop, we mean this, and then people have a much better idea of what they're voting for.
Would a unilateral right to leave the backstop be acceptable to you? The whole backstop's got to go.
Yeah. The backstop has to go. Who's going to be carrying out these negotiations? Who will be deciding in 2022 whether we are in or out of the backstop? You could find that it was a unilateral right not being exercised by a socialist government, that we voted to leave the European Union and leave we must do, whereas this backstop issue is simply delaying our departure and could delay it for a very long time.
Let me put a point of view to you that no doubt's been put to you before, but it's worth putting again, I suppose, which is, look, aren't you really letting the best be the enemy of the good, indeed the enemy of getting anything at all, that if you carry on like this, the Prime Minister's not going to get a deal, you won't get no deal, you will get extension and therefore possibly in the end revocation?
I think the risk on that has to be balanced against the unsatisfactory nature of the deal as it is agreed at the moment, the withdrawal agreement. There are compromises that people are willing to make, but the backstop as currently constructed is not one of them because it keeps us under large swathes of European law for a potentially indefinite period. So we haven't really left. So what you're saying is, look, here is the Theresa May deal, which doesn't give you all of what you want, indeed doesn't give you a lot of what you want. It's £39 billion for nothing, and you're potentially tied to EU law in certain areas for a long time. There is a risk that people will use obstruction to this to stop Brexit altogether. But bear in mind how sensitive people are when you accuse them of that. Even Yvette Cooper is insisting she's not trying to stop Brexit. Now, I don't actually believe this. I think the people who are seeking delay are seeking to stop Brexit.
You think Nick Bowles is trying to stop Brexit?
Oh, yes. This is all about stopping Brexit. This is not about delay. It's about no longer accepting the referendum result. And I don't think anybody could vote for the Cooper Amendment who did not want to stop Brexit. So there is a risk that these forces have their way, but it is nonetheless interesting that they are careful to say that is not what they want to do, that they in fact have accepted the referendum result. So the risk that they go the whole way and they get a majority in Parliament to go the whole way is, I still think, pretty small. So you are faced with alterations to Mrs May's deal, which I think is a reasonable possibility, or leaving on the 29th of March with no deal.
Is that right? Because the counter-argument is once you extend, and with a bill they may well be able to extend, once you extend, it's for the sake of the argument like virginity, you've lost it. It's a thing that you cannot go back on. Once you've done it once, it becomes easier to do it again, and again, and again, and again, if the EU is willing. And in that way, slowly the resistance to revocation by way of a second referendum breaks down. That's the risk, it would be said.
I think the chance of it being revoked is slim, and I think the political effect of going down this route would be very strong. Bear in mind, over 400 constituencies voted to leave, and therefore to go against that is difficult. And MPs will face a choice on Tuesday when it comes to the Cooper Amendment of deciding whether they are trying to frustrate Brexit or not.
Is there a risk instead, from your point of view, that there's extension, but instead of settling on a second referendum with an eye to revocation, the House settles on Norway Plus, which from your point of view would be Brexit in name only and arguably worse than staying?
Well, nothing's worse than staying. I think there's very little support for Norway Plus. It doesn't seem to have traction. Indeed, rather the reverse, that as people have looked at it, it's one of those things that people thought, oh yes, that's a good idea. Then they looked at what it would actually mean, and as they've got into the detail of it, they've come to the conclusion that Norway doesn't work. The City of London cannot be a rule taker. You cannot have a situation where rules just flood into the UK without any say over them, and you have none of the advantages of your own trade policy. So I don't see Norway's getting traction, and the loser's vote is getting the reverse of traction.
I read somewhere today, and it may well be completely untrue, I'm simply raising it as a thought point, that it was claimed that the Prime Minister said privately that whatever happens, she will not allow no deal.
Well, then she shouldn't have pushed through legislation that provides for no deal.
You're accepting it's possible that she does think that?
I don't have the greatest insight to the Prime Minister's inner thoughts, and it would be wrong of me to claim that I did.
Could we just explore finally where you are on this vexed business of prorogation? I mean, you said last week, a fortnight ago in the last Moggcast, that it would be very unwise simply to shut Parliament down from, say, now until after Brexit Day, or the day on which Brexit's due. But you're not against prorogation, are you? Because prorogation doesn't necessarily mean that.
No, that's absolutely right. Prorogation will happen anyway in April. So people who are getting frankly upset about prorogation don't know that this is a routine part of our constitution, and all laws that are not passed in that session, subject to certain qualifications, fall. And this is why most backbench bills, private members' bills, fall, is because of prorogation. They're just finished off. It's not unusual, and it's a tried and tested part of our constitution. My view of prorogation is that the government could, in extraordinary circumstances where the normal forms of the House of Commons have been broken, decide that it was going to use prorogation in a way that hasn't been used recently, but was used to help get bills through under the Parliament Act to get into a new session and things like that. So it is something that has been used within living memory.
When was it last used, by the way?
I think it was used in the 1940s.
There's not a danger that the Queen would be dragged into the vulgar business of party politics?
Definitely not. It's not a decision of the Queen. It is an action of the government in the Queen's name, as all actions of the government are in the Queen's name.
Is that how all voters, or a substantial chunk of voters, would see it?
Well, it's how everybody involved in politics would understand it. The Queen acts on the advice of her Prime Minister. The Queen's statement to the Sandringham Women's Institute has to have been approved with Downing Street. The Queen cannot give opinions without them being the opinions of her government. Now, there is a tradition around the Queen's Christmas message where it is very much a personal message from the Queen. This was not the Queen's Christmas broadcast. This was a briefed message on a current political issue, and it has to have been, as the one on Scotland must have been, with the consent of the government, if not encouragement.
That's not how most people will have read her statement on the Scottish referendum at the time, is it? They will have read it as a personal view.
It is inconceivable that the Queen would have said something about the
That's not quite the point I'm
Scottish referendum
trying to explore.
without it being clear. I think governments do like to use the Queen in this way, that as with the Queen's speech, the Queen reads out the government's words, but the Queen does not have personal views in this sense. She can only have the views of her government.
So should we read that message as a message from the government via the Queen that the compromise we should all accept is the Prime Minister's deal?
Well, the Queen didn't go that far. The Queen it'd be unusual to ask the Queen to go that far, except in the Queen's speech.
But she went in that direction, you're suggesting, because she wouldn't give a message of her own, she'd give a message that was approved by the government.
The government must have approved that message. I think it's inconceivable that that message was not run past Downing Street.
So the government would have thought that the message of the message was to support the deal, even if the Queen
didn't. And one can't know what the Queen's inner thoughts were on this.
All right. I think this week we have to end there. I mean, I thought the discussion about the amendments was complex enough without getting into whatever the Queen may or may not have been thinking. But at any rate...
Well, we're in fascinating constitutional waters, and the changes in the House of Commons do potentially have an effect on ways other parts of our constitution operate.
I thought it was possible. She was so alarmed by what you'd said about prorogation, she decided she had to come out and give a statement, but clearly I was wrong about that.
I would be very surprised if Her Majesty paid any attention to anything that I said.
I wonder. At any rate, she may be listening to this Moggcast tomorrow, for all we know.
Well, if she were, we ought to be standing up, but we're not, so I doubt Her Majesty will be listening.
I'm sorry you say that, because the listeners would have had no way of knowing whether or not we are or not. But until next time, whether we're standing up or sitting down, then, Jacob, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees-Mogg about the topics of the day.